Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Eunice Olembo. We are just about to kick off on this webinar, so kindly bear with us as we give other attendees about 2 minutes to join us, then we can start. Thanks. I think we can go ahead and begin. We shall have the rest join us as we proceed. So good afternoon once again, good morning, good evening from wherever you may be joining us from. I do need to apologize for technical hitches. My camera is off, so apologies for that. So my name is Eunice Olembo. I am the legal officer with Minority Rights Group International. Thank you for taking your time today to join us this afternoon as we commemorate and mark the International Day of Indigenous People that was celebrated on the 9th of August this week. Joining us today to discuss and unpack an intentional call for new social contracts for Indigenous people are our panelists from Kenya and Uganda, representing community human rights defenders from the Bennett and the Bato communities in Kenya, and human rights defenders representing the Pare community in Taita Taveta and Turkana. Joining us as well, we have NGOs, Kenya Human Rights Commission from Kenya and AICM from Uganda. So at this juncture, I would like to do a quick introduction of our panelists before we jump into our discussion of today and the topic of our webinar. So joining us from Kenya, from the Kenya Human Rights Commission, we have Furaha Charo. Furaha Charo is a land rights practitioner. She works as a program advisor in the Lands and Natural Resource Governance Department. She is passionate and exceptionally sensitive and dedicated advocacy worker with a strong commitment to human rights and general community service. Thank you, Furaha, for taking your time today to join us. From Kenya as well, representing the Turkana community, we have Mr. Eliud Emery. He is Executive Director of Turkana Bio-Alloy Organization that coordinates the Turkana Land Rights Network. Bona Eliud, thank you for your time today, and thank you for joining us. From the Pare community, we have Ms. Dina Majabu Robert. She's a member of the Pare minority community and a community worker with the Taita Taveta Human Rights Network, and a member of the Pare Land Rights Defenders. Madam Dina, asante kwa leo. Thank you for joining us today. From Uganda, we have Nixon Omviti. Nixon Omviti works the African International Christian Ministry, AICM, and is a program coordinator under the Climate Change Project, whose targets are the Bato Indigenous people in southwestern Uganda and the Bennett Indigenous people in northeastern Uganda. Thank you very much for your time, Nixon. Joining us, we have Precious Arinda. Precious Arinda is Executive Director of Africa International Christian Ministry. Bona Precious, thank you for your time today. Joining us as well we have Faith Tushabe. Faith Tushabe is the immediate former Executive Director of AICM, but she is similarly, Faith Tushabe, we have Faith Tushabe who is joining us. She's a social development worker, researcher, and human rights defender who has experience gained from community work among vulnerable groups, such as women, children, youth, and indigenous ethnic minorities in Uganda. As a human rights defender, Faith believes that we can only enjoy our rights as human beings if we promote gender equality and equity for everyone in all developmental initiatives. Thank you very much, Faith, for your time today. From the community, we have Chebet Mungech. Mr. Chebet works with the Bennett Lobby Group and is currently the program coordinator of BLG, a local non-governmental organization that champions for the rights of the Bennett people. He is passionate about securing the rights and interests of the Bennett Indigenous people. And finally, and not least, we have Kenneth Turiambona. He is executive director of Batwa Community Development Organization in Kanungu, Southwest Uganda. He works on sensitizing the Batwa parents on the education of their children, Batwa communities on their land rights. Thank you very much all for your time today. I hope that as we discuss this and as we unpack this, we can shed more light on what it means to be able to develop a new social contract for Indigenous communities. So I'd like us to just jump right into it. And my first question would go to our community human rights defenders, Mr. Mungech, Mr. Eliud, Madam Dina. What does the World Indigenous Day mean to you as community human rights defenders? Mr. Eliud?
Can you come up again?
So the question was, what does World Indigenous Day mean to you as a community activist?
Yes, thank you. Being a human rights defender, hearing of what that is the World Indigenous Day, this means it is an event where the indigenous groups across the world celebrate and be able to reflect on the challenges faced by these groups and trying to share experiences and coming up with mitigative measures on how they can be adaptive to the challenges faced and be able to develop a roadmap of engagement to see to it that their rights are being respected. Thank you.
Ms. Dina, as a member of a minority community in Taita Taveta, what does marking the World Indigenous Peoples Day mean to you? I think Ms. Dina might be having an issue with her microphone. Maybe I can pose the same question to Kenneth. As a member of the Batwa, an indigenous community in Uganda, when you hear World Indigenous People Day, as a historically marginalized community member, what does this mean to you?
Indigenous, of course, the word indigenous means a group of people that are very few in number. And this specifically brings us, the Batwa, into the group.
Maybe now, Mr. Precious and Mr. Nixon, Madam Faith and Furaha, as members of NGOs and community-based organizations and CSOs that advocate for the rights of indigenous communities and that advocate for the rights of historically marginalized people, what does the World Indigenous Day mean to you? Number one, as activists, but then number two, as guardians, so to speak, in the strict sense of the term, of minority communities and historically marginalized communities. What does this day mean to you? Maybe Faith, you can go first. As Faith is working on her microphone, Furaha?
Eunice, please come back again.
My question is, as NGOs and CSOs that are working in the field of protecting and advocating for the rights of Indigenous communities, what does the World Indigenous Day mean to you? Number one, as advocates for the Indigenous people, but also as, so to speak, the frontier and the frontline defenders for historically marginalized and Indigenous communities. What does this day mean to you?
Okay, the World Indigenous Day today, what it means to us is that number one, it's a day to remember and also acknowledge Indigenous communities, because most of the time you find that because of their numbers, you find most of them they're not given enough recognition. So today being Indigenous, 9th August being World Indigenous Day, it is a day to remember Indigenous people and recognize Indigenous people. And also for me as a human rights practitioner, this is a day to reflect on the challenges that Indigenous people face, and also try to look at the legal and policy frameworks, both locally and internationally, and try to sort of do like an appraisal of how far they have gone towards recognizing and also sufficiently protecting the rights of Indigenous communities. Thank you, Eunice.
Thanks. Maybe Nixon, from the point of view of the work that AICM is doing with the Batwa, the Bennett in Uganda, what does this day mean as an NGO? What does this day mean for you?
Thank you, Eunice. First of all, to me, it's a very important day for us to commemorate. One is because Indigenous people world over have the rights and they deserve protection. And to me, the 9th, or the day we are celebrating today, is such an important day in that it draws our attention, the attention of all the players in human rights protection, in the fight for the Indigenous people's rights, in the fight for Indigenous people's land and other human rights issues, so that their rights and the protection of their issues can be well put together and echoed for a better action. Today, we are actually bringing into attention, maybe probably to the world over, or to the different stakeholders, the issues that Indigenous people face, the issues to do with the marginalization, the issues to do with discrimination, so that these issues form a basis of our intervention, our basis of our advocacy, and in the basis of our fight for Indigenous peoples. Of course, these are issues that a common person will face, but these are issues that we need to echo, especially when it comes to Indigenous people, whom we know in relation to Batwa and Bennett, whom I work for. They're the people who do not have land, they're the people whose rights are always violated and so on. Basically, that's what the day means to me as a human rights defender, as somebody who works with these Indigenous people, Batwa and Bennett. Thank you, Eunice.
Thank you, Nixon. You've raised one very salient issue, the question of land, especially for Indigenous communities and historically marginalized communities. So there's a very close link, an inextricable link between the collective land rights of Indigenous peoples and their rights to self-determination and self-driven development. However, we find that across the board, lands, territories, and natural resources, Indigenous peoples have been consistently denied access to their ancestral land, have been denied the ability to be able to determine how to use the natural resources on their land. So my question to you, Mr. Mungech, would be, as a member of the Bennett community, and as a human rights defender within the Bennett community, how has a continued lack of access to your ancestral lands contributed to the question of not being left behind as a Bennett community, as the Bennett community?
Okay, thanks, Unit, for posting that question to me. As a Bennett and as a Bennett activist, the denial of the Bennett people in accessing their ancestral land has left them behind in many occasions. One, cultural, the Bennetts are unable to practice their cultural and spiritual events that used to be before, because they were a forest dwelling community, and much of the cultural sites that were belong to the Bennett people are now carved inside the protected area. This to name is caves. We have those sacred areas, barrier sites, and to date, the Bennetts have really been curtailed and denied accessing those sites that used to be of great importance to their culture. Secondly is there is a constant denial of the Bennett accessing resources. This is in terms of foods, the forest foods. We have the medicinal herbs that are found in the forest that were very important in terms of treatment of certain diseases to the community. And then again, we have certain tree species that were so much attached to some culture, some clan basis in terms like there are certain tree species that were of great attachment to the people in a way that they used to support them as foods, like the bamboo shoots, which now have been totally denied to be accessed in the forest. I think that way, the Bennetts has really been left behind, not accessing much of this.
Thank you very much, Chebet. Possibly I would pose the same question to Kenneth with regards to the Batwa community. How has the lack of access to services and access to and the lack of the community being able to fully exercise their social, economic, and cultural rights, how has this adversely affected the Batwa community, and how has this contributed to the Batwa community continuously being left behind in the question of development and in the question of access to services?
Thank you, Eunice. This has contributed to a lot of development in the Batwa communities. First of all, our culture. Since the Batwa lived in the forest and were evicted from there, our culture has completely been lost. What we used to do in the forest, what we used to wear, our language, we no longer speak it. And this has greatly pushed us back compared to other tribes. Secondly, since our culture has been lost, there is the resources such as food. We no longer access food. In the forest, we had free food, honey, meat, and other things. But since then, we no longer access this. We have to work for it and access it, and we are not the same as other non-tribes. Therefore, this has continued to push us behind in terms of development. Again, another point is the access to education. Currently, education is the most expensive asset in Uganda. And as you know, the Batwa, we cannot manage, or we can't afford to pay school fees for our children. Therefore, we've been left behind in terms of development. Another point is about discrimination. Since we cannot afford ourselves to provide social services, we have been discriminated by the non-Batwa. For example, when a Mutwa goes in school, he or she will not look like other children. We look somehow dirty. We cannot afford our other services like good shoes, good uniforms. And this has left us behind. Yeah, thank you, Eunice.
Thank you very much for that, Kenneth and Chebet. The theme for this year, for the World Indigenous Peoples Day for this year, is a call for a new social contract. So my next question would go to our human rights defenders, Precious, Furaha, and Faith. How has the current social contract, as it currently stands, perpetuated the marginalization and oppression of Indigenous and marginalized communities. Possibly Faith, if you could go first.
Can you kindly repeat the question, Eunice?
How has the current social contract, as it currently stands, perpetuated the marginalization and oppression of Indigenous and historically marginalized communities?
Thank you. First of all, when we look at the Indigenous people, we look at them as the native, the cultural ethnic groups that have been settled by others. Most of these people have been evicted from the natural resources, evicted from the forests, and they have, some of them have not, most of them have, or almost all of them have not been resettled. And so the fact that they don't belong anywhere itself is something that has affected them as Indigenous people. The fact that they are not in any political representation, the fact that they don't have formal jobs, the fact that they are less educated, the fact that they are a minority makes them, I think, affects them socially, I would say. I don't know whether that answers your question, Eunice.
Yes, it does. Farah, would you like to build on that?
Yes, thank you so much, Eunice and Faith. So yeah, I think just in addition to what Faith has already alluded to, is that currently we see that most of the marginalized have not gotten, there's no equitable representation, even in the different forms of, even arms of government. For instance, even in the National Assembly, which are the Parliament, which are the policy-making institutions, and the executive, and even more so even in the judiciary. So you find that because of that low representation in these crucial organs of government, you find that there's no, they lack somebody, or rather an avenue, to be able to raise some of these critical issues. And even so with devolution, because like for instance in Kenya now with the devolution, we had hoped that devolution would increase access to services. But in most cases, because of corruption, you find that actually it has led to, it has more of devolved corruption, and also somehow also devolved tribalism, because for instance, we see in some counties, especially like some counties, you find that only the predominant tribes in some of these counties are able to get like majority of positions, majority of even jobs, majority of resources, and so forth. So I think even with the, I concur that even with the current social contract, is that it does not so much favor the Indigenous communities. And in as much as human rights organizations, for instance, like the Kenya Human Rights Commission, have really tried to conduct sensitization alongside, targeting some of these Indigenous communities and trying to bring together different stakeholders for awareness and knowledge, for awareness and passing knowledge about the Indigenous people and their needs. I think more still needs to be done, and certainly we can achieve so much more if we are able to push for recognition of Indigenous people and the fact that they are human beings, and by being human beings, they're entitled to human rights, and therefore it's not a favor that some of these maybe government regimes are doing, but it's within their mandate, and the fact that Indigenous people are human beings, they're entitled to some of these rights, like for instance, like the right to housing. I mean, these socioeconomic rights that more often than not we see them being violated, either by investors or even sometimes by government agencies. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your insights, Furaha. Over to you, Precious. In your opinion, and the same question to you, how has the current social contract continued to marginalize and perpetuate oppression against Indigenous communities and the historically marginalized? Precious? Okay, I think we might have lost Precious. We can bring him on board on the next question. Now, my question to you is Mr. Eliud. When we speak of a social contract, we're talking about a contract in the strict sense of the term between government and its people, with the government having a duty to protect its citizens and to make decisions based on the common and general goodwill of its citizens. Now, as a member of the Indigenous community, as historically marginalized persons, how do you think the current situation and the current setup with regards to the social contract is continuing to oppress, especially say now for your case, the people of Turkana?
Thank you. First, I would like to reiterate that the Kenya people and the Turkana community specifically voted for the Kenya Constitution 2010 because they saw it was a moment where their rights and also economic social rights will be respected and also adhered to. So only to learn that that is enforcement of the two arms of government in 2013 to date, they realized that the high expectation they had expected from the county government, where the resources were being devolved, and even from the national government, the two-tier, was not really a reality. And putting in mind the current situation, the Turkana community have realized that their priorities are not priorities of the leadership. That is, here we are talking of both legislative arm and also the executives, because these are institutions that have tried to spearhead their interests at the expense of the community. This is putting in mind the current challenges the Turkana community are facing on land. One is that in the recent report that was released by Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, that indicated that Turkana community is living in poverty index, that is 79.4%. And this cannot be equated to the national funds that are normally received by Turkana County being receiving the second highest allocation. And this means there is no value for money. So, and also in addition to that is that Turkana community, being an area whereby the Kenya government has begun developing, that is the oil infrastructure. You find out that they are not being involved in the mainstream. The other thing is that the public participation, which is key in the Kenya Constitution, is not being adhered to. So then that means that the issue of free, prior, and informed consent is not an issue with the government, or the involvement in the management and use of the community land is being violated. So this leaves underlying question: is the rights of indigenous people an issue to government? Because this thing has escalated in security, and there is laxity from government to see that the economic, social, and cultural rights that are being that are very clear in Article 43 of the Kenya Constitution is not being adhered to. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that, Eliud. Unfortunately, I think we lost Miss Dina, but you have brought up certain salient key elements when we're talking about social contract. Number one, you've highlighted the right to participation. You've highlighted the right to free, prior, informed consent. and you've highlighted the issue of resource allocation. So now, and my question now goes to you, Mr. Mungech, as a member of the Bennett community. When we're talking about resource allocation and with the establishment of the Mount Elgon National Reserve, how has the Bennett community been adversely affected in this process, taking into consideration the question of free, prior, informed consent, the right to participation, and the question of resource allocation?
Okay, thank you, Eunice, for posing that question to me. First, as a Bennett, I must acknowledge that the great issues that the Bennett are facing today are historically dated to around 1936, when the Bennett forest land was carved as a British Crown area and demarcated on top of the mountain. With progressive developments that the father embarked on in 1980, around 1983, the Bennetts were identified as encroachers in their own land, and where there was a request that the Bennett be evicted from their land. And though the plea was later done and during Amin's regime, later in 1983, the Bennetts were given a part of their land for resettlement, to resettle them, because they were few in number. By Amin's regime then, who acknowledged that the Bennetts were paying tax to Uganda, and they were native citizens and the original inhabitants of their land. So they were not supposed to leave their land. But during the process of allocation then, the Bennetts, because they were not educated at the time, they had not been opened up to this modern way of education. The people who were in church resettlement then were the non-Bennetts, who were from the plain lands. So they used that opportunity in a way that much of the land that was reserved for the Bennett were given to their relatives, and even they took huge chunks of land to themselves. From that time, now to date, the Bennetts have been living as squatters in their own land. Currently, there are areas that have not been developed to date, like Kisito and Kapsekek, where we have no primary school, no secondary school, even a health facility, because the constitution currently provides that it is in the national park, and no permanent or development is done to this land. So the Bennetts have constantly been denied access to much of it is a fundamental rights, much like education, like health, because we are unable to provide basic education to our young ones, who would later transform our community in a way that these schools have not been constructed here, and we have lagged behind really in terms of education. We find that if we are to look for our educated youth or children, they are just numbers in a community that would have really been part of the ionic development of this country. Health-wise, we have really seen a great gap in terms of health provision to our communities. One is that we do not receive services that would really support the life of the indigenous Bennett people. And the gap between us and the non-indigenous Bennett has really widened in a way that even just the basic curative drugs that would really support the treatment of certain small diseases are not really found in our health facilities. And to make it worse is the stigmatization that we get in these health facilities. When you are known as a Bennett and you speak the Kumsop language, you are really sidelined in terms of treatment. If you would have really come first, you may not even be served the whole day. So this has put us in the periphery of development in this country, which has left the Bennetts in the margins of discrimination that has faced critically the community of Bennett. And then in terms of access to education again, we see that our children can really trek for longer distances We have like 15 kilometers to the nearby schools that are down to the plain, where our children, the young growing children cannot really afford to. And due to the poor road networking that has really put to our area, compared with now the weather conditions that are really in this mountain, it has made it really difficult for the Benet child to really afford and access this education. So the historical breach that led to the grabbing of Mount Elgon into a protected area without the knowledge, the prior knowledge of the Benet people, has really created a untold gap, which has later turned into untold suffering to our community. So we have had a lot of challenges that really we feel that it has breached the Benet development agenda as compared to other parts of the country.
Thank you for that, Mungech. Maybe the same question to you, Mr. Kenneth. And now, with regards to the Batwa community, how has the social contract, as it currently stands, with the duty that the government has towards its citizens, not just the majority of its citizens, but all its citizens, and not just the citizens who are in the majority, but also those who are in the minority? How do you feel, and how do you feel that the current social contract, as it currently stands, has continued to leave the Batwa people behind?
The Batwa, thank you, Eunice. The Batwa have been left behind since their eviction because we face a number of challenges. Right away from our eviction in 1991, we have faced a number of challenges, which will include mismanaged, politicized resettlement process. Right away from 1991, when the water was evicted, it has been characterized by delays, mismanagement, and a lot of political interference at all levels. The spirit of compensation was to be done immediately when we were evicted from our ancestral lands, but it was never done. And this has continued to leave us behind. There has been unfulfilled promises by the government. Sometimes, most of the time, the government officials, when they meet us, they keep on promising us that at one time the government will remember us, and this has never been done. Therefore, not being considered by the government from be political, civil, to hold any office, or have any representative in the government offices have left us because we cannot benefit from the national cake. Our rights have been violated by the people in charge. For example, the Uganda Wildlife Authority guards, we cannot access the forest to get what we used to have there. Other people that we live with torture us. And when we go to report, you are asked to pay money. That money, we cannot afford it. Therefore, our rights are being violated and we are being left behind. Now, marginalization. Right away from the time government evicted us, we have never participated in decision-making processes, ranging from political and civil platforms on matters that directly affects us. Originally, because of our low education status, we hold no position of authority, and this means that we cannot favorably compete for any position. There is also alarmed by the continued reduction of the Batwa population arising from the high infant and maternal mortality rates. Absolute poverty and lack of special attention by the local governments, especially in the districts where the Batwa live, we are not considered at all. Therefore, this has been an alarming issue for the Batwa. Thank you, Madam Eunice.
Thank you very much for that, Kenneth, and for your insights. Eliud, you had something to add on to this?
Yes, thank you, Madam. Yes, yeah, in reference to the Turkana community, in addition to what my colleagues have just highlighted, is that um, uh, truly Turkana, about 68% of the Turkana population are pastoralists. And being pastoralist, pastoralism is the main economic activity. So these are what is happening now is that pastoralism is under threat because the government operations that is within the community land, that is the increased influx of private investments, in addition to the oil fields operations, has really threatened that is the existence of the indigenous people. At the same time, that the laws and the policies that are being passed and enforced in Kenya, these laws are unfriendly to the IPs, that is the indigenous people. And to this, you find out that these laws have empowered as the cabinet secretaries, that is the community land chief registrar, and the kind of requirements that communities have to adhere in registration of their land are so high that it is hard for the indigenous people to comply. Giving an example is that Turkana, being an area where oil fields are, and the government in the past years piloted that is the production of oil around the developing infrastructure, you find out that there is a value index act that was passed. This act has evaluated, that is the value of land in Turkana. And in so doing, the government is also trying to speed up that is development of infrastructure and their projects within the community land. Yet there are no guidelines to regulate on the compensation, on resettlement of people that will be affected from those areas, and at the same time being able to account or the issue of transparency and accountability in the extractive sector. So the community are in the dark, and the kind of public engagement that are engaging is selective, and they use the provincial administration to that is to threaten and intimidate that is the human rights organizations and also the human rights defenders within the community that are trying to advocate for the indigenous people's right. And this has also resulted to micromanagement of development partners that are supporting. That's why some of the organizations, us being one of the victims in the project that we have been running, is that because of pushing government to be accountable to the people in prudent use of public resources becomes a problem, and makes some development partners to be threatened in supporting some organizations that are dealing with social accountability and human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Eliud. And with that, I think you bring me to my next question. And in view of this year's theme, a call for an intentional new social contract. Now, I'll throw the question back to you, Mr. Eliud. What does a new social contract mean then, in view of what you've posited? What does a new social contract then mean for the Turkana community and for the indigenous communities that you advocate for?
Yeah, my understanding is that this is the engagement now between the duty bearers and the right holders. Since that that is the right holders, who are the citizens, who deserve to be served by government regardless of their social, cultural, or whatever background. They are supposed to be served without discrimination. So in so doing, that there is no consistency and also a clear strategy in ensuring that the economic, social, cultural rights of the indigenous people that they are supposed to serve is being adhered to. So there is selective service delivery and inefficiency in addressing the priorities of the people that they are serving.
Thank you for that. So from what I'm hearing from you, it's a question of access to services for all. Across the board, access to services for all, effective and efficient efficient delivery of services. The same question to you, Mr. Mungech. From your point of view, for the Bennett community, what would you like to see change as we discuss a new social contract? When we are talking about, you've mentioned the question of access to services. You mentioned the question of free, prior, informed consent. You mentioned the question of participation. What would you like to see as a member of the Bennett community? What would you like to see change in the manner in which the government then interacts with Indigenous communities? Sorry, you're on mute. You're on mute. Unmute yourself.
Okay. Thank you, Eunice. What I would like to see a change is that one, in terms of education, I would like to see systemic actions that are aimed at providing services in the field of education, health, housing, and the general well-being of the Bennett people. Because one, as we have said, that education is a pillar of development now across the world. And as Bennett, who had been left behind for a number of years without access to quality education, yet we are really supposed to compete with the general well population of Uganda. I would like to see that government provides systemic actions that are only provided towards bridging the gap in the field of education by constructing good quality schools for the Bennett people in clearly accessed areas so that we could also support the development of this country in terms of education, and that the Bennett can also be in position to build its human resource that can work for its populace. Secondly, health-wise, we would like to find corrective measures in which government also provide quality health services to the people, and where traditional knowledge-based health systems require, we requested that government can allow the Bennett people to really access their historic traditional medicines that were of quality towards curative of certain diseases to the Bennett people. I would also like to see a comprehensive process that government does in terms of mitigating measures that the Bennett had lost, especially in terms of resettlement of the people who had really lost opportunity for a number of years, because the people had been left as squatters in their own land, yet they are really citizens of this country. So government should provide mechanisms in which such people are resettled so that they can be in a position to support their families and also contribute to the general development and well-being of the country. Then thirdly, I would see that government should desist from relocating the Bennett people from time to time without their free, prior, and informed consent. Because since around 1983, the government has had played games of relocating Bennett from time to time. Latest is in 2011, when they relocated the Kisito people in a purport that they were going to live temporarily for 6 months. And the 6 months has turned to years. And then how can we really, how can such a populace provide or develop themselves in terms of housing? They don't have where to live. They are just living out with neighbors. So government should really desist from this relocation of the Bennett people from time to time without their consent. And then we also see that the government of Uganda should acknowledge the Bennett people as the original inhabitants of the Mount Elgon area, and give them special consideration in terms of use, preservation, and legal protection of their traditional knowledge in terms of environmental conservation, because these Bennett people had lived with their environment intact, and yet currently, with the current concern and management of Uganda Wildlife Authority, we see our ancestral homeland that was once forested and intact, just being commercialized for their own gains. And then government should also carry out a thorough investigation of all rights abuses meted by authorities, especially Uganda Wildlife Authorities and other state actors. And therefore, the victims in terms of the victims to these circumstances be compensated for the loss of their resources, because we find that during the relocation of the Bennett people, the Bennets lost their wells in terms of cattle, they had beehives. So the authorities then burnt people's houses, looted people's property. So these people lost their resources. So government should devise mechanisms of compensating these people so that they can play part in the development agenda of their well-being. That's what I can have.
Thank you for that, Mungech. Maybe to you, Kenneth, as we're talking about a new social contract, the question of access to services forms a key element of the component of a new social contract. What do you think this would mean for the Batwa community?
Thank you, Eunice. This new social contract should mean for the Batwa, and specifically this should be from the government. I would call upon the government of Uganda and its organs to at least find alternative adequate arable land for the Batwa indigenous in compensation for our lost ancestral lands, the forests. I would also like to see the government putting in place a resettlement action plan for the Batwa indigenous Pygmies. The resettlement plan should be well packaged within built mechanisms to promote trust, ownership, sustainability, empowerment, and respect. It should include at least 2 acres of land, housing unit with a pit latrine, kitchen, and a clean water facility, household utensils, agricultural implements, and inputs. Thirdly, I would like to see the government putting affirmative action for the Batwa through established mechanisms that compel the government institutions and local governments where Batwa live to provide access to social services, such as education, health, and facilitate Batwa's participation in development programs so as to improve their livelihoods. Another point is to improve service delivery and infrastructure and budgetary allocations for the development of the Batwa. We should also be considered in the government budgets as other people are considered. Another point is to meet its legal and moral obligations towards promotion and protection of the rights of the Batwa Pygmies as an ethnic minority group. Recently, there are some Batwa that were killed in Kanungu. I saw a lady being killed. We reported the case, but the police could not mind. They wanted the money to first go and see if they can arrest the suspect. And the suspect is around, but our human rights are violated because we cannot be helped. Another point is to put in place a mechanism that will provide periodical report on progress made in all the above for accountability. Therefore, if all these points are put in place and followed, I would think that new social contract will have been achieved. Thank you, Eunice.
Thank you for that, Kenneth. Now, my question would be to our NGOs and CSOs on the ground who are constantly fighting and working very closely with our community human rights defenders to continue highlighting the plight of our indigenous and historically marginalized persons. My question to you, Precious, what would a new social contract mean for you as a human rights activist, as a human rights defender?
Thank you, Eunice. A new social contract, to me, like, of course, the theme says, I would wish to see intentional action that specifically targets the minority, the indigenous peoples where they are. For example, my colleague Chebet and Kenneth have just mentioned issues concerning resource allocation. But even before we get to resource allocation, what is the representation of the indigenous people even at local government level? Which is there anywhere they are involved? Are they at any point invited, for example, for budget conferences, for district planning meetings, things like that? Sometimes you may even find that there could even be some little things like water springs allocated to the communities where these indigenous people live. But because they are not involved in the planning, they are not involved in the budget conferences, they cannot even know that there is anything that they can claim. We want to see proper planned allocation of social service to the communities where the indigenous peoples live. We want to see schools there. Of course, they have gone through discrimination, they have gone through marginalization in the normal UPE schools, in the normal USE schools. So now these children are not able, Chebet mentioned the long distances they have to walk to access schools. The same applies even for health centers. Can we have at least health center tools at the places where these communities are, that are specifically for the Batwa, for the Bennett, and any other minority or indigenous peoples wherever they live? We want to see, realization of these acts and declarations of the government and promises, like my friend says, practical realization of these things, not just coming and saying, okay, the government is going to resettle you, or the government has allocated that land. And in the actual sense, when you walk to the land, or when they try to occupy the land, you will find that it is actually the land belongs to the government officials. They cannot occupy it. When someone has just made a declaration and said, okay, this is land that was allocated to the Batwa or to the Bennett, and so they should settle and live there following their eviction from the forests. So we want to see practical realization of some of these declarations of the government, that when it is mentioned that this land is allocated to this particular group of people, then they should occupy the land, they should settle there, such that they can begin to have survival and livelihood. And so we want to see, maybe on my own behalf, and of course on behalf of the civil society, we want to see practical realization, we want to see intentional action for the indigenous peoples. We want to see inclusion at all levels, district level, at the lowest level of leadership, that where they are in the different places, they should have cells. A cell here in Uganda is like the smallest level of leadership at the chairperson LC1s. So we want to see who are LC1 chairpersons that are able to handle the issues of the Batwa, to respond to cases of the Batwa, to forward them to the police, to follow them up, such that they are reported and responded to. And they can only do that if they are included in the leadership system, if they are included at the leadership levels. Want to see village health team members, VHTs, who are Batwa. The government has VHTs at all the villages, but in the Batwa communities, or even the Bennett communities, we don't have VHTs there who are trained, who can speak on basic health material, on basic health care things, who can inform the people that, by the way, there is Mama Kit at the health center. If you walked there, you pregnant woman, you could get something that can help you. If you have malaria, go and check. There is you can get some medication. Some of them don't even know what they can get at the hospital or what's there, what service they can be offered to, of course, despite the discrimination and sometimes them being abandoned when they get there, they don't even know the service that they can access while there. So we want to see full inclusion. That's what I call intentional action. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that, Precious. Maybe to you, Nixon, what does intentionality and inclusion, when we're talking about a new social contract, as a human rights defender, as a frontliner, what does that mean to you when you talk about intentionality and inclusion of Indigenous people and historically marginalized people in the formation of a new social contract?
Thank you, Eunice. I think in this, I want to draw our attention to 3 issues in relation to the new social contract. One issue I want to draw attention is the issue of recognition in the law, especially in the constitution. Like for our case in Uganda, we know our constitution is not clear on who these indigenous people are. They're all bundled under the marginalized people. We realize that indigenous communities like the Benet all along have been struggling with the issue of statelessness. So in the new, maybe in the new social contract that we intend to have, there must be a deliberate move to recognize the indigenous people like the Patwa, the Benet, as an ethnic group that can have a voice to collectively push out on their issues. And then, of course, we have talked a lot about the issues of access to services, access to social services. There's also another key issue of access to justice. You realize that all along, like the Benet, the Batwa have been struggling. Batwa have been struggling to hear their case. There have been a question of being denied access to justice, like previous speakers have just said, police asking for money. Those are issues that we need to push for in the new social contract. Of course, we have ever talked about the issue of deliberate action or affirmative action. Indeed, minors recognizing these the individual rights and so on. There must be, like we said, deliberate action or affirmative action. You realize in the different government programs, there are programs that are aimed at like bridging the gap, the disparities in self-delivery, disparities in the income distribution. When you talk about youth livelihood programs, the MIOGA, the Operation Wealth Creation, these are programs that purportedly are aimed at bridging the income gap between the poor and the vulnerable, kind of. But you realize that if we go on drawing board, if we ask ourselves how many Batwa are benefiting from these programs, how many Benet are benefiting from these programs. So these are the issues that in the new social contract, which we, maybe the members of civil society or the activists, the human rights defenders, need to push forward on the issue of affirmative action. When it comes to youth livelihood programs, there must be affirmative action, especially in considering Batwa youth in accessing those programs. When it comes to Imyoga, there must also be affirmative or deliberate action to make that the Batwa, the Benet, and the other marginalized communities, indigenous people also benefit. Even the same thing with the Operation Wealth Creation. And then I'm sorry to say that apparently we are, the country is going through maybe vaccination against the coronavirus and so on. Where are the interests of these people? We realize that in the previous, Kenneth has just told us that Batwa, the numbers are under threat now. In the case, maybe Corona comes in, because they'll be wiped out. So there must also be now, in this social contract, there must be a deliberate effort making sure towards access to services of this, for this special like health and even vaccination for COVID-19 vaccine. So these are the issues that we need to dwell on, especially when we are trying to redefine the social contract for the indigenous people. So when we relate to leaving no one behind. So if we want to have a government program to improve livelihood, we should never leave any other indigenous people whose right to land add my voice onto.
Thank you for that, Nixon. Sorry, I think we were having some glitches at some point, but I think we've been able to pick out your salient issues, and you correctly have highlighted the question of access to healthcare in this particular situation, the question of the COVID vaccines in terms of how and who is advocating for the right of indigenous communities to access such amenities, and rightly put. My question, and possibly my last question, would be to Furaha. When we talk about a new social contract, we're talking about self-determination, self-driven development, and again, equitable access to services. As a human rights defender, as a frontliner, as a practitioner, what does a new social contract look like to you for the indigenous community?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Eunice. And I think the previous speakers have really touched on that aspect very well. For me, it's just to emphasize that because in Kenya right now, we are seeing a lot of developments are coming up. Investments in large-scale farming. We are seeing investments in the mining and the extractive sector. Turkana, for instance, we know lots of oil companies are likely to set base in Turkana. The Taveta, we know that minerals, there's a high likelihood that more companies are likely to go there, especially gemstones, because actually currently in Kenya, the only gemstone center is in Voi, the entire Kenya. So that means that Taveta is likely, it's very rich in minerals, apart from Kwale County also. So for me, my concern is to see that when we talk about a new social contract for indigenous communities in terms of self-determination, for me, my call is that we see increased participation of especially indigenous communities, because most of these minerals, most of these investments are happening in unregistered community land. That is number one. Most of these lands are not registered. In as much as we have an act in place that calls for this registration of community lands, in Kenya, there's a lack of political goodwill to register these lands. And therefore, when these lands are not registered, whenever there are these plans of investments, there's a lot of speculation. And therefore, whenever this speculation happens, communities are dispossessed of their lands, and therefore they are shortchanged whenever it comes to issues of compensation and issues of relocation, and also issues around environmental management and conservation, because we see now with increased cases, with conversations around climate change, I believe that indigenous communities are better placed to manage environments for the virtue that they stay in these areas, and they're the greatest beneficiaries in these areas. And of course, they have been custodians of these lands way before even the formalization of some of these management systems. So for me, what I want to see is that there's increased participation, and not just cosmetic, but meaningful, free, prior, informed consent. We want to see that the rights, because among the principles of governance is transparency and public participation. So what we want to see is increased participation of indigenous communities. We want to see these indigenous lands registered, because the big gap comes whenever maybe there's a project and you find that the host community or the indigenous community have not been registered to these lands. So whenever maybe there's a need for compensation and relocation, you find that indigenous communities are left out, sometimes are even shortchanged when they come to realize that maybe the land has been registered to a private developer who community does not even know of. So for me, it's the call for recognition of indigenous people, especially in issues of governance, and the respect for their rights, and intentional involvement of indigenous communities, because these are their homes. And in as much as minerals because in Kenya, according to the constitution, minerals are categorized as public land. But we need to understand that even if they're public land and the state is the custodian of public land, the government needs to understand that they're holding it in trust for the citizens, for the people. So the fact that it's public land and the government is in charge of public land, it should not, that does not override community interest or indigenous people's interests. So what I want to see in terms of this new social contract is an intentional move towards increased participation, increased recognition, and increased respect of the rights of indigenous communities, because as we understand, land is not just a commodity of exchange, but rather so many values are tied to it. So that is what I seek to see in this new social contract. And as human rights, as the Kenya Human Rights Commission, we are committed to supporting indigenous communities to be able to push for this, to be able to raise their voice, and we are willing to support them and amplify their voices towards the respect and the promotion of the rights of indigenous communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Furaha. As we draw to the tail end of today's webinar, I have two questions that I have received, two questions, two comments. The first question, I would like to share it with Faith. One of the human rights activists is facing a lot of hardships due to his or her stand against violations of human rights. So I'm not too sure whether this is in context of Uganda or Kenya, but maybe Faith, you can speak in context of Uganda. Then Furaha, I can give you a chance to speak in context of Kenya. This is very similar to the second question. I think you can both answer them as one. So Faith, you can answer the context from the context of Uganda and from the context of and Furaha from the context of Kenya. In case of activists getting threats, where can they get help? This is from Daniel Ntanana Olesha. Faith, maybe you can go first. Okay, I think Faith might still be having issues with her microphone. Maybe Precious, if you can support on that one.
Thank you, Eunice. The question is in case of?
In the event now, I would like you to speak to the context of Uganda. For human rights activists who are facing human rights violation and threats, where can you direct them? Where can you direct them for assistance?
Okay, thank you, Eunice. Of course, human rights activists in Uganda, so yes, true, some have faced challenges in their move for advocacy and other things that they work on. We have the Human Rights Commission that is a body that works to the defense of human rights activists, and also there are some legal aid providers, service providers that that support or that back up human rights activists. And also there are also civil society coalitions and bodies that bring together different human rights activists, different organizations that are in the area of human rights who are in the areas of human rights activists. And so those platforms and forums can also be areas where you could air out any issue of violence or humiliation or hindrance or challenge that you meet as a human rights activist. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Precious. Maybe Furaha, from the context of Kenya?
Yeah, so in Kenya, how we support human rights defenders when they're experiencing threats, security threats, is that mostly we first advise reporting to police, the nearest police station, after which now based on the severity of the threat, at Kenya Human Rights Commission, we have partners who do who have projects around protection of human rights defenders. So whenever a case is brought to us and we are able to assess, we're able and refer it to the institutions which mainly are concerned about human protection of human rights defenders, and then from there now they're able to take it up, whether it's supporting somebody to, whether it's supporting the human rights defender to a safe house or getting them out of the country, but now based on their expertise in that. So now they're able to assess how severe the threat is, and then they're able to take the necessary measure. So for us, what I would advise is that any human rights defenders who are maybe experiencing any security threats, they can, in Kenya, they can reach out to the Kenya Human Rights Commission, after which now we can refer to the organizations who are our partners, who specifically focus on protection of human rights defenders, after which now they're able to get the necessary assistance. But first, we recommend that the threat is reported to the police station before now we are able to take up other remedies. Thank you.
Thank you for that. As we draw towards the tail end, we have one last comment. This is not a question, this is a comment, and someone from Bangladesh who is empathizing and sharing the experience from Bangladesh, where even the government has signed a peace accord with the indigenous people from the Chittagong Hill tracts. And after more than 2 decades, the government has still not implemented the key agreements in the accord, including recognition of the land. Also important is that the area is still heavily militarized with over 400 army camps. So our participant is indicating that it is the military that is the most responsible for stealing of indigenous people's lands, and usually for commercial enterprises. Yes, with no other questions, I would like to say thank you all for your time. For our panelists of the day, Mr. Elliot from Turkana, Furaha from KHRC, Nixon from AICM, Kenneth representing the Batwa, Precious from AICM, Chebet from BLG, the Bennett, and Faith Tushabe from AICM. I would like to say a hearty and a very deep thank you for your time today. Thank you for the work you do on the ground. Thank you for continuously advocating for the rights of indigenous people. At times it is a thankless job, but we know that through it all, we are in the right fight. So thank you very much. And as we wind up, I hope that we can continue to do the good work that we're doing, not only within the region, but around the world. As you can see, it is not only indigenous people in Africa who are facing challenges. We have indigenous people in Bangladesh, and this calls for more rigorous interaction for the indigenous communities globally to be able to continue to advocate for the rights of indigenous people. That being said, I would like to say thank you once again. And from the background, thank you, Loic, for being the assistant behind the scenes. Yes, and have a good afternoon, and until next time, have a good evening. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.